So hi, I'm Liz Marlowe. I teach in the art department and also in the core program. I teach core legacies of the ancient world, and I also have created a new minor at Colgate in museum studies along with my colleagues in the art department as well as anthropology and history. So I want to talk to you today about this quite interesting object, this hand-painted scroll that was purchased on a trip to India that was taken by a group of faculty, 27 faculty members, in 2012. We were all faculty members who teach in different aspects of the core curriculum, and we came together. Our then President Jeffrey Herbst got a grant from the Mellon Foundation, which paid for this quite wonderful 2-week trip to India that brought us all together to have a whole series of conversations about the relationship between the past and the present, modernity, science, technology, the relationship between science and culture, and a whole range of issues that touch upon the basic themes of Colgate's core curriculum. For me, one of my favorite moments on this trip was when we went to the Delhi Craft Museum, which is an unusual museum in that it contains both a kind of historical collection of crafts and art objects made all over India, but it also has a component sort of outside the main building. There's a whole separate area where they have invited artists and craftsmen and artisans from all over India to come and stay at the museum and do a kind of artist residency there. And so they are on site making their objects, making their crafts, and then also selling them directly to museum visitors. So when our group went to Delhi, we were sort of circulating around this back area, and I was quite struck. I saw one of my colleagues also observing a woman who was standing in front of a whole series of painted scrolls, like the one I'm standing in front of now, but instead of talking, she was standing there singing quite beautiful, moving, kind of sad, mournful songs. So I went over, I joined my colleague, and we had a pretty extensive conversation with her about the artworks that she produces and what these songs are. It turns out this is, I learned from her, this is a rich tradition that's practiced primarily in the region of West Bengal. It's a practice that goes back to the Middle Ages and possibly even older than that, where family groups organize themselves in units where there'll be one family member who is a composer of songs, somebody else will compose the lyrics, and then there's an associated member of the family who is responsible for representing the song in visual form. So these are kind of family clans that create these songs and then a visual image that goes with them. And then another member of the clan will have the role of being the kind of itinerant bard who travels around to religious festivals and performs these songs in festivals that are sometimes competitive, where these itinerant bards will all gather together and perform their music. They're also always religious festivals, so this is a way of honoring the gods. And the topics of these songs and the scrolls can range from kind of the very traditional, going back to the Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. This woman had a number of scrolls that illustrated episodes from those epics, but there were also some that told about more recent episodes in history. So she had a scroll that was narrating the sinking of the Titanic. There was another one that told the story of India's struggle for independence. She had a couple that dealt with the events of 9/11 in the United States. So a whole range of genres that are being translated into these traditional song painting performances. So this image is telling the story of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, right, which started as an earthquake off the coast of Indonesia, was a massive tsunami that traveled all the way across the Indian Ocean and killed about 250,000 people all on one morning in 2004. So this is an image of that very tragic event, and you can see the way the artist is creating a narrative out of that kind of fundamentally incomprehensible event. It starts with this large image of a very fierce-looking deity at the top of the screen, and you can see waves of energy radiating out of his head, and then he reaches down with his arms into the human realm, right, and kind of literally manipulates what's happening down on Earth with these hands and these frightening pointy fingernails. Then the bulk of the image is taken up by this watery scene where you see bodies floating in the water here. We get some kind of crocodile or sea creature. Here in the middle of it, one of my favorite details, we get an anthropomorphic helicopter, so a helicopter that has a sort of human form in the front, probably meant to be understood as a deity. This helicopter is coming and rescuing people out of the water. Here on this side we see here, and then down here we see television reporters with their cameras trained on the event, watching what happened. And then in between the reporters, we actually get scenes inside people's homes where you see people sitting around watching the events unfold on their television. So we see it sort of simultaneously happening in the real world, and we see how that real world event was experienced by people who watched it in their homes. Then down below, there's an image of a benevolent water god who we're supposed to understand is under the sea and who is protecting or sort of taking care of the deceased people who've come to join her in their watery graves. And the imagery around the border with this floral pattern, my colleague in the art department, Padma Kaimal, has suggested this kind of floral motif may be meant to indicate a kind of regeneration that is possible after a tragic event like this. I like to use this object in my museum studies class for two reasons. Number one, I think it's a really useful reminder that when we look at a work of art in a museum case, we are usually, in fact almost always, only getting a very small portion of kind of the overall story, the overall purpose for which that artwork was created, right? The vast majority of religious paintings that were created even in the European painting tradition were created to be objects of devotion, not meant to be seen in museums, but to be seen in religious contexts, for example. In this case, we know that when we look at the painting by itself, we're missing the whole song and performance component of which this painting was originally only one piece. We've tried to recapture a little bit of that. So you can see on Colgate's website, we have a link to a recording that we made of the performer that we encountered in the Delhi Craft Museum, this woman, Momi Chitrakar. We have a video of her singing the song that goes with this. But of course, most of us, when we go to a museum and we look at works of art in cases, even if there are videos available, we don't always take the time to really think about a work of art as part of a much larger performance that was meant to be embedded in a very particular kind of viewing experience. So that's one aspect of this object that I think is really helpful for thinking through what it is that we gain and lose when we look at objects in museums. The other thing I like about this object, and it's what I've tried to capture a little bit in this big display here on the 5th floor of Case Library with all of these panels that you may have noticed framing the object, is that a powerful object like this, I think, really has the power to pull people together. It can exert a kind of magnetic force and bring people together in conversation. We had conversations, really rich conversations, both in India when we were standing in front of this object in the Delhi Craft Museum, and then also back here on Colgate's campus. I've had rich conversations with my colleagues in a whole range of departments. There's actually write-ups here from members of 12 different departments across campus, all of us bringing our different perspectives to this object and sharing really valuable insights. So for example, my colleague Patricia Jew in chemistry observed that the pigments that are used here are probably not vegetable dyes. You can tell from the much brighter colors that we see here, this really rich blue of the water, the hot pinks of some of the women's clothing. Those are not colors that you can obtain with vegetable dyes. So we wondered if maybe what we were seeing in this choice on the part of this artist to use synthetic dyes is a kind of way of understanding the way that this artist has adapted her traditional practices for the tourist market that she's creating this object for, right? This is no longer, this particular scroll was not created to be carried around to religious festivals by these itinerant bards. This particular painting was created to be sold in the Delhi Craft Museum. And so perhaps accommodating to the expectations of tourists who want bright colors, who want colors that won't fade if they hang the painting on their wall, she's made the choice to use a different type of pigments than perhaps would have been traditional practice for her. My colleague in geography, Maureen Hayes-Mitchell, has studied that 2004 tsunami and has studied the way that the impact of that catastrophe was much more disproportionately felt by women. The victims of the tsunami were quite disproportionately female for a variety of interesting cultural reasons, and that fact has been captured in this image where the vast majority of the bodies represented in the water are women's bodies. So this artist is really understanding and showing us something that is very telling about the different kinds of impacts that a natural disaster can have. Let me give one more example. My colleague Karen Harp in geology talked in really interesting ways with all of us about the fact that geologists are increasingly making use of oral histories, such as the kind we see here, oral histories about disasters, as a way of understanding geological events that predate scientists' written records of these sorts of events. Very often there's a lot that geologists can learn from oral histories about geological events that may have happened centuries ago, when those stories get handed down generation after generation. So this is an example of that kind of oral history that geologists are increasingly paying attention to.
And some of the closer shots too.
How much does that cost?
9,000.
9,000.
Yeah.
Yes, can you go? Yeah, dye is filled. So
সাংবাদিকের দল সুনামিতে কেড়ে নিল প্রাণ অভিশপ্ত সুনামিতে কেড়ে নিল প্রাণ
Namaste.